All right. Well, welcome. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is our first ever webinar for our very own book. My name is Courtney Powell. I am the Director of Ministry Content for Women in Work, and I am joined by Courtney Moore, who's the founder and president of Women in Work, and she also edited our book. And so we are really excited to kind of host this conversation with you guys tonight. But our goal is for each of you to get to hear from all of these amazing contributors. And so tonight is going to be a night where we just hear from them. We're going to ask them some questions that some of you submitted, and we're really excited for you guys to be joining us.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. Give me some thumbs up or some hey in the chat. Yes, I see Barbara from Tallahassee, not Tallahassee. Let me get it together. Erica. Okay, good. I'm tracking. Everybody's here. My name is Portia Collins. I am from the Mississippi Delta. I've got a sidekick who is coming over here to say hi. This is the joys of life. This is my daughter Emery, and I wrote chapter 6 in the book, which is basically on don't waste your gifts and how we should be good stewards of the work that God has given us. All right.
Yeah, so I am Jen Oshman. I live in Colorado in a suburb of Denver, and I have been in women's ministry now for well over 20 years. We were missionaries and church planters overseas. We lived in Asia and Europe and have been back in Colorado for 7 years. And so just been a joy coming alongside women, both in ministry and in the workplace. And I wrote chapter 4, which is entitled, You Are What You Do, or Are You?
All right. My name's Amy Whitfield, and I live in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, and I am on staff at the Summit Church there. I'm the executive director of communications, and we have been in that area for about 11 years. We've got 2 kids who are now about to both be in college, so we're kind of moving into a very new season of life. I wrote chapter 10, so I kind of finished it out on developing and growing your gifts. So it's about leadership development for women in the workplace.
Hi, I'm Joanna Meyer. I'm here in Aurora, Colorado, not far from Jen at all. And I wrote the chapter on the grief and the grace of my unexpected career. I serve as the director of public engagement at the Denver Institute for Faith and Work. So I think about work a lot, but I'm also single. And so I shared a little bit about my journey, both the opportunities that being single has afforded and also some of the pain in navigating the bigger role that work would play in my life than I may have anticipated.
Yeah, that's great. Elise, let's jump to you. Oh, wait, I think you're muted, Elise. Sorry, Elise, I see your mouth moving, but I don't hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
Here I am. And I'm also old. So I live in Southern California. My work has actually been across a spectrum of writing and speaking and counseling. And I wrote the chapter, it's a foundational chapter in the book, just about work and how we should think about work biblically.
Yeah.
So I've been married for 48 years, and but I've worked pretty much my entire married life. And so work has been a good and something that I've really loved being involved in.
Yeah, that's great. What about Missy? Let's hop to you.
Hello, I'm Missy Branch. I live not far from Amy in the Raleigh-Durham area, and I recently began a new position with an organization called the Life Collective. My job is VP of Community Engagement, and I have 4 children, the youngest of which just graduated from high school. And it's crazy, but I have, so now 2 in college, 2 completely out of the house. My husband is a professor over at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and which we love that place. And my chapter is on image bearing and our good works. and just the idea that God has given all of us work to do, no matter who we are and what it is our station is in life.
Yeah, that's great. Hannah, what about you?
I'm Hannah, and I'm coming from Southwest Virginia. And I stumbled into my work. That's the way I think of it. I don't know that I ever really expected to be doing the work I'm doing, which is as an author primarily, and do some speaking. But one of the things that I've stumbled through over the last 10, 12 years of the work God has given me to do is how we do it in our bodies. And so that's really a fascinating question to me, that all of the work that we do is played out in really material and practical ways. And that a lot of the stress and tension we feel as women may not be a result of us, but it might be the systems and structures that we're coming up against. So I love puzzling through that. And I wrote chapter 5, which is Bodies of Work.
Yeah, that's great. I think I'm probably the last one to go here. I introduced myself at the beginning. I'm Courtney Powell for Women in Work. I serve as the director of ministry content, but in my job, my day-to-day job, I serve as a operations consultant for a nonprofit that does mission work all throughout the Middle East, North Africa region. So that's been a really fun role, and I wrote the chapter 3 on Am I
so
Called?
I had the privilege of editing the book and kind of give a little bit of vision for how we wanted each chapter to go and what we hoped they might pull from the Bible. And each of them came and just brought their A game, and I learned so much.
So I was really thankful
loved being able to collaborate with each of these amazing women.
Courtney, we will swap it over to you. Tell us about kind of what your role was for the book.
From each of them, and it was such a joy and a privilege to get to.
Yeah. So, hey, before we dive in, there is a chat box over there. Portia already introduced it. If you have any questions that we don't cover, feel free to throw them in the chat. I can't guarantee that we'll get to them, but we want to have them over there. But before we kind of really dive in, I would be remiss if I did not thank Fernie Cosgrove. She is our book club coordinator. And I don't even know if the authors know this. You probably haven't even seen it, but she created this beautiful resource to go alongside our book club. That's a booklet. It has a bunch of, we each wrote questions for the end of our chapter, and she added several more. And then Maddie, our director of communication, kind of put it all together in this beautiful book. It's really nice. It's really lovely. And I just wanted to thank her for doing that, just for taking the time to do that. So we are going to dive in, and we're really excited. Elise, I think I kind of want to start, maybe just throw this out for you, but anybody feel free to jump in. But I would love to know, one of the questions that we received was, what do you wish that you knew about work when you were starting out? Like, what do you wish as a young woman, maybe starting in ministry, starting to write, whatever it may be, what do you know now that you wish you had known then?
Yeah, thank you. And that's a really good question. I think what I would want to tell my 20-year-old self or 30-year-old self was, it'll be okay. I think that there was a sort of a drivenness that I felt, that I sort of felt like I've really got to get this stuff done. And if I don't get it done, then I don't know what would have happened. Just to look back over my life and say, God's got this. He's had it all along. He got me to where I assume where he wanted me to be. And the many ways in which I sort of was freaking out and just afraid, worried, pressured. I don't think I needed to be those things. The Lord had a plan for me. As he has for all of us, and he will fulfill his plan. Psalm 57, verse 2 says, I call to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. So we have a purpose. whatever
Yeah.
that may be. I don't know. And sometimes we think it's one thing, but it's actually something else. But the Lord was gracious to me to continue to sustain me and help me and direct me through times of success, but also through times of loss, times when I felt like what I was trying to do wasn't going to happen. The Lord's got it,
Yeah.
and He'll get us all where we need to be.
That's really encouraging. Missy, what would your answer to that question be?
So my 20 years ago, I didn't have much good sense. So I feel like just the idea that God is faithfully walking you through all of these things, even though you may feel like the decisions and the pressure and the ideas and the resource comes from you, genuinely God is faithfully walking us through it. And so that, like Elise said, whether we're talking about loss or we're talking about incredible victories, through all of it, I can trace the through line. I've said this several times, the through line of God's faithfulness. And I think if we were to pause and really look, we can see how through all of it, the Lord has brought us through. So you can, just like Elise said, she's right. You can relax. It genuinely feels like everything is on fire, but at the end of the day, you realize that's just a match that a little kid lit in the back. It's going to be all right.
You always have the best analogies when it comes to those kinds of things. Even when I was writing this question, it's funny. I am 34, and I think my answer is just not as mature. I'm thinking things more like, oh, man, your college degree, you might not end up doing that for a living. So it's okay. Those are the
true.
kinds of
You're
things
right.
I've heard. But that's all right. Well, hey, Joanna, I wanted to direct this one towards you. One of the things that we've realized is that your chapter specifically in the book about kind of the grief and of a unexpected career is really struck a chord with women. We were just talking about that earlier.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, just share a little bit about your journey as a single woman that kind of had almost like an accidental career, just what that's been like. And then I would love for you to kind of discuss some of the strengths and anybody can jump in, but I would love for you to discuss some of the strengths and weaknesses of how the church has been able to serve you over the years. What are things the church did well, and what are things that the church needs to do better?
Okay, you gave me the loaded question. So I'm going to start just with my own journey. I was excited coming out of college about working. I trained to be a high school social studies teacher. And so I knew that I would teach for a few years, or I hoped I would teach for a few years. But I assumed that eventually I would get married, hopefully sometime like in my late 20s, I think I envisioned. And I hoped that getting married would answer the bigger questions about direction, contentedness, identity in my life. And I'll let you in on a little secret, that didn't happen. And I blew through milestone after milestone that you would expect to happen in the life of any woman, but I think especially a Christian woman. And I didn't check off any of the boxes. I headed into my 40s and I thought, I'm going to have a vibrant, compelling life. I was doing work that I enjoyed. My career has spanned everything from the corporate sector to campus ministry to being a sewing instructor at an indie craft shop in Denver. I've done a little bit of everything, it feels like some days. And so I just kept working because I needed to financially, but I experienced a lot of heartbreak because I didn't have a broader understanding of why my work mattered. And then I was experiencing the grief of things that weren't happening. I wasn't getting married for medical reasons. I lost the ability to have kids during the pandemic. I had a big surgery that ended that hope in my life. And so I didn't have a lot of examples or stories of why my life matters and how to be stewarding it. And I think that's what's really resonated for a lot of people in the women work community, is that probably in that 35 to 50 age range, there are a lot of women that are reaching that breaking point where they're like, I had hopes and I've done everything right, And some of those deep heart desires have not been fulfilled. And so what do I do with myself? I think we saw a little video clip from the podcast interview we did to promote the book. It's gone viral. We've had 184,000 women watch it. And the level of emotional outpouring and response has just been profound. I mean, I've lived this experience and I had no idea that there were so many women who were struggling with that. And so I think it has implications in a couple of ways. Personally, I needed a bigger framework for my life. In my own relational circle, no one was modeling what bold singlehood looked like or what a rich biblically based vision for work and calling looked like. And so when the frame I thought needed to be part of my life wasn't provided, I was at a loss. And so I needed a bigger picture for my life, something to call forth my gifts. And goodness, I have leadership gifts. And so what do I do with myself in a faith community that isn't acknowledging my leadership gifts? There were so many ways that I was a bit of an outlier in my faith community. So personally, I needed a bigger. This is going to be a hard answer because I can think in so many ways of the beautiful things that church has provided. It's provided a solid foundation of faith and the knowledge that has led me to a deeper understanding of God. It's provided the tools I needed to live faithfully in the complexities of modern life. On the negative side, there's a lot there, to be honest. There is not a comfortable place for singles, especially older singles in the Christian community. I can't tell you the number of times I've been in incredibly awkward and painful situations because sisters in Christ did not have the awareness that people in the room weren't like them as far as marriage and family. And I think as far as discipleship, there's just a discipleship gap. They were not speaking to women about the broad integrated vision of life with God and for his purposes in the world. And so you end up being an outlier if you're a leader or if you aren't checking some of those most identifiable boxes of marriage and motherhood. So there's some real gaps there. And that's why one of my passions is to come alongside women's ministry leaders. I'll just flag that. If you're curious about this, please reach out to me because I would love to talk to you about this. But I would love to see more women's ministry leaders provide a very, very broad invitation for Christian women that's as broad as the needs of the world, as broad as Christ's redemptive work in the world, an invitation for us to fully steward our gifts. Because regardless of our life stage, we all need our lives to fit in that broader framework of Christ's redeeming work in the world.
I can hop in. I mean, one thing I think that I help teach our women's Bible study, this is such a small thing, but I do think it matters, or I hope it does. Even when I'm trying to come up with illustrations when I'm teaching through something, I try not to only use illustrations from the perspective of a wife and mom. Just it's such a little thing, but I think that it helps broaden the audience. It helps women maybe feel less isolated. I mean, obviously a lot of my experience is going to use those things, that is my experience of the world. But I think that, I am more than a wife and mom. And so I think that that's just a really small kind of way that me and the woman that co-teaches with me, that we've tried to be really intentional in that way.
A lot of years ago, we planted a church in a city, and we actually didn't have a lot of women. The women there were single and were just out of college or were trying to figure out what was the next step in life. So we really had to embrace a context that was not about everyone's a wife and a mom. And it was actually really very refreshing because I am that wife and mom that was not my dream. I didn't want, if I was to be completely honest. And I come from a space where being a wife and a mom is not held to the same regard that it is in different other spaces. And so it was almost looked at, you're lazy if you don't want to work outside your home. And if you just want to be a mom, like, what is that going to do for you in 50 years when your kids are gone? And so really I had to think through what it meant to see womanhood as this big thing with all of these dynamics. And wifehood and motherhood are beautiful, but that's a dynamic of the big mosaic called womanhood. And it really allowed me to dive into all of the depths of what it meant to be a woman so that I could connect with every woman in that room whose life experiences were, where some places would say mine was the great one, the life experiences of these women who were making their way in the world with them and Jesus far surpassed a lot of ours, because they did not have the quote security or quote easiness or whatever that I think we believe comes with that. And so I think if we were to really be honest and begin to paint a full picture of womanhood and all of the ways in which God has presented it in the Bible and presented us to the world, then we would do a better job in our churches, because womanhood is giant.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can I jump in here? I heard somebody. I think I'll go out on the limb and say that my church could do a better job of seeking out those women who are single, or who, not just young women who are single, but older women who are single, or people just who don't fit the standard, the model. And I use the term standard loosely because being married with children is not the standard. But here where I live in the Mississippi Delta, which is a very interesting place, but from a Southern cultural perspective, getting married and having kids is the thing to do. And it is honestly not a lot of people or a lot of women in my church who are not married, who don't have children. And so I think this is an area of opportunity in terms of actually seeking out those that we can minister to. Hold on, baby. I don't know why every time I turn my mic on, she decides she wants to come over here. But here we are. You have to be quiet or it's gonna be trouble, okay? Thank you. Thank you. Go sit down. Thank you. Exactly.
This is like prime
real life. This is my life all the time.
Yes.
And I'm okay with it. but seriously, I think that we could do a better job of ensuring that the church is a safe place and a welcoming place for people who don't necessarily look like everybody else there. And I think that's just an element. I talk a lot about diversity, but that's an element of diversity that has nothing to do with ethnicity or anything like that, but diversifying our churches in a way that reflects women in all stages of life.
That's really good. I want to ask a question to kind of piggyback on this topic. And it's going to be directed at Hannah, but I would love to hear from all of you. Just because Hannah wrote a chapter on our bodies, but I think we're living in this kind of cultural moment right now where our bodies, women's bodies, are almost... It's funny because I think we even talk about this. She talks about this in her chapter about how sometimes work, it almost wants you to pretend like you don't have a body, right? Where, we're supposed to ignore XYZ, but then, there's this whole other element of women's bodies maybe just not mattering. It doesn't, the biological makeup of a woman doesn't matter as much anymore because a woman can be XYZ. Hannah, I would love for you to kind of talk with us about some of your thinking, even when you were thinking about our body and work, about why it matters that women have the bodies that we have. I even think about Joanna, you talking about the grief of no longer being able to bear children. I mean, that's a real grief that exists, and it's unique to women because of our bodies in a lot of ways. And so, Hannah, I would love for you to just kind of talk through how you see that playing out kind of in our culture about almost this ignoring the implications of what it means to be an embodied person. I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, Courtney, you bring up two significant cultural kind of phenomenon that at first glance may not look like they're related. And you see this tension even in the conversation. You see kind of a conflict between those who would say that the female body is malleable or you can become a woman versus maybe more strident feminist voices who are really holding to the uniqueness of embodied femaleness and saying, no, we fought for, the female body. And I think what's underneath them, there are roots that connect both of those kind of fruit in society. And I think what's underneath them is, in general, our understanding of identity is that we manifest ourselves. What we're kind of coming up against when we come up against the reality of the female body is that we can self-create it. We can make a female. We can kind of produce a woman. That's the myth that's happening within culture. But within the workplace, if you can create a female body, then you can uncreate it too. So it goes both directions. So you can dismiss the things that would get in the way of being able to function in an environment that runs up against the femaleness of your body. So for example, in the chapter, I talk about how so many of our workplace structures are male-shaped just by virtue of the culture and how for so long the marketplace has been a male-shaped presence because of just the dominance of the number of workers within it. And within our modern life, we also have this drive toward efficiency, which, female bodies aren't necessarily the most efficient to get you from point A to point B. Something as simple as a monthly cycle is deeply inefficient. And so our marketplace and showing up in that space that is already male-shaped, that doesn't align with the embodied selves that God has created women to be, that doesn't have room for things like vocational calling to motherhood, or that kind of cycle of needing, greater margin if you're carrying a child or if you're nurturing an infant after you give birth. Showing up in those spaces creates an inherent conflict. And what the marketplace asks us to do is uncreate ourselves, to reduce and pull back our womanhood and almost deny its reality. Because again, the fundamental assumption is we are the creator of ourselves, whether it's our identities or our bodies. So on the one hand, you can manifest your womanhood in this way, and you can create, whatever your body needs to be. But we also face the pressure when we show up in marketplaces to deny realities about ourselves and to uncreate it. And I think as a woman, some of the most courageous things that I feel God has called me to do is not deny my body and be able to create the boundaries and margins that I need to do my work and say, you know what? I am showing up, all of me, and these are going to be the limits that my body as female can do. But there's an inherent conflict there, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, because otherwise each individual woman somehow thinks it's her fault, that she couldn't keep up with the demands of the marketplace, that she has failed somehow, when in reality it's more likely that the infrastructure around us is asking us to uncreate ourselves.
Yeah, that's Jen, you've written on this a little bit too. You've talked about you have written a little bit on gender and kind of what the importance is of being a woman. How do you feel like even just to kind of piggyback on what Hannah was saying, I mean, what is your kind of reaction even to just this idea that women a lot of the times are asked to deny, their bodies in the workplace? I think it comes out in so many spaces. As you were talking, Hannah, I'm thinking of all the different kind of places that even when you have a baby, it's kind of like you're expected to jump back in. But Jen, I know you've written on this a little bit as well. I'd love to hear some from you too.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what Hannah said. She really laid such a helpful foundation, one that I think that we're not really allowed to explore. Like, I would imagine probably for a lot of the women listening to this, they're like, yes, you have put words to something I have felt, but I've never been a part of that conversation. But honestly, this has been coming, sort of since the Enlightenment. That's kind of when we started to say we're going to be self-made people, that we don't have to obey creation or live in these bodies, but we can make ourselves, as Hannah pointed out. But obviously things really sped up over the last century, and specifically during the sexual revolution. So second wave feminism, for some reason, we decided that equality equaled sameness. And we, as a society, decided to prioritize the male body and norm the male body. And as Hannah said, to see pregnancy and childbearing and mothering and nurturing life as a pathology that needed to be cured by the pill or by abortion, and that our value is really when we can express ourselves as males. And that's just done a ton of harm. And I think that we're just seeing the fruit of that now in some of the socio-political things that are going on. But it really is a shame, because I think we have lost sight, and I'm so thankful for this book and the words of the women on this call. You know, we have lost sight of what it means to be a woman, in that we are unique. You know, God did not create another Adam; He created Eve, and there's important, essential things that are fundamental to who we are as women, and it's important that we acknowledge them and celebrate them and walk in the reality of them. But I think we've just begun, and we Christians really need to dive in here and use our voices and our pens and make sure that this conversation is cast broadly. It's not a popular one. It's one that will get you canceled, and yet it's the truth that will set our sisters free, right? For them to know these good things and the goodness of how we were made. And so I hope that this conversation just gains momentum, especially in the church and beyond.
That's good. So I'm going to throw this out to anyone, and Hannah will hop in, but I would love whatever you're going to say. I want to hear it. But just be thinking about, I would love for you, if anyone has any practical suggestions for women to kind of push back against the idea that you have to act like a man in whatever way that may be to be successful in work. Like, what are some really practical things? We have a comment, even in the chat, of a woman that is in healthcare, and so it's like, well, she works with predominantly women, but maybe the system itself perhaps isn't designed for a woman's body to thrive. But what are just some really practical tools? What are some practical boundaries, or just things we can do to thrive specifically as women in our work settings?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer to take this from a kind of high level to a really practical embodied reality, because I do want to say, when we talk about obviously pregnancy and motherhood seems to be like maternity leave, that's a clear question, but again, not every woman is called to motherhood, and so that's maybe not going to be a specific issue she faces. But one thing I think that really brings us down to grassroots is, for the most part, women as a class have, how many decades of a menstrual cycle. And I want you to think about what that means every month, and what that means when you have to show up to work when your body is going through that cycle. And then I want you to remember that you have the same number of days off as men do. And so you have the same number of sick days, while you probably have easily 12 weeks over the course of a year of increased physical difficulty just to function. So pragmatically and practically, what I would say to women is take all of your sick days. There is no merit in showing up to work when you're not feeling well, when you're having a day where your body is doing what it's created to do. Honoring your womanhood means not being afraid to say, you know what, I need a day off because my body is doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, that's really good.
Courtney, I'll just jump in really quick. My internet's weird, so I might disappear, but I really appreciate that. I know that in third world countries, period poverty is a real thing. And women who really don't have the things that they need in order to be in a workspace while they're menstruating, it creates poverty for them because they cannot work. And this, I'm so glad that this conversation is getting pushed forward, and books are being written about it from a Christian perspective. So I'm really glad my sons have read books about what it's like for their wives to have a period. And guys need to know these things, but women also need to say, hey, yeah, I need this day off. I can't do this thing you want me to do. right now, and that's okay. We don't have to pretend that we have the same kind of body anymore. Do we?
Yeah. Courtney, were you wanting like strategies, practical strategies for how a woman shows up, like in a corporate setting, for example?
I think so. Yeah. I think a corporate setting would be really helpful. Like, what are some ways that we can, just show up and we can be female and we can celebrate that, and we don't have to pretend like we're not women,
I have a couple thoughts on that, having worked in the corporate sector. And one is realizing that there is real bias, whether it's acknowledged or not, against the way that women lead. Like, studies show that women, qualities that you would typically associate with a female leader, they often lean towards the ability to be forming and maintaining relationships, communicating in a way that solicits consensus, all kinds of unique kind of feminine attributes actually are good for companies. We see teams thrive. We see financial performance increase. We also see ethical violations decrease. And so there's statistical evidence that women's leadership is an asset to a company. And yet we have decades of modern working life in which our thoughts on leadership have been trained to a masculine model, like Hannah was saying. We know what leadership looks like. I was a fan of the show Mad Men that was on, which followed advertising executives in New York in the 60s. It is not a moral show, but the hero, Don Draper, who was really kind of an anti-hero for his values, he exuded American masculinity for how he carried himself. He was emotionally reserved. He was confident, he was directive. And so we often associate those qualities as being the mark of a good leader. And so for women, one of the challenges is navigating that double bind of the challenge when we step outside some of those gender specific roles. If we try and act like a man, which sometimes women have tried to do, we're not always viewed as being likable. There's a real relational consequence of how you're perceived when you act like somebody that God hasn't made you to be. And so you're in this bind where it's like, okay, I can be viewed as competent and not likable, or everybody can like me, but that may mean my leadership perception takes a hit. And so the challenge, I think, is to be crafty in a really godly way of asking the Holy Spirit to help you discern where are some of those gaps in which I could act slightly out of type. I'm not saying change who you are completely, but just being crafty and aware of situations in which you could step it up and maybe act against type to demonstrate leadership and show up. And often it's like split second timing. If you know where an opportunity is, like, okay, I'm a performance review, I was told I need to be more directive, or I need to not be dependent on other people's opinions, then look for specific examples of that. Exercise those qualities when it's going to help your team be healthy and effective. But if there are moments in a critical meeting or in a conversation with someone who's above you in the organization in which you can step up and work against type to fill in those gaps that are perceived in your leadership, go for it and ask the Lord to strengthen you through the Holy Spirit to know those moments and have the courage and wisdom to know how to step into it. And I wish that wasn't true. That's an extra burden on us to have to interpret ourselves in the workplace, and yet I think it's real.
Yeah, that's a great point. Joanna, I want to kind of piggyback on what you're saying. Amy, your chapter in the book dealt with leadership and learning and kind of growing even as a leader. As a woman, I would love for you to kind of talk about what does that look like. Missy, I want to hear from you too, because I know both of you have been in positions where you've led teams of people, both men and women. I would love to hear just kind of what the unique challenges were, even just as a woman in leadership, but also how you led, from a position of being a woman and being feminine and not letting that like prohibit your leadership in some way.
Yeah, so, my career's been in ministry spaces. For the most part, it was in denominational work, and then only recently on a church staff. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic where, particularly in the moment when I started kind of getting put in some leadership roles and having teams under me, and I would have men and women under me, but when it came to my peer relationships, I was often like the only woman in the room, maybe one of two women in the room. So it was always interesting because growing as a leader, a lot of times you're kind of figuring it out yourself. You're in these spaces where networking looks a certain way. And I mean, I was very fortunate because most of the teams that I was on and my colleagues, they really went out of their way and always have in several different spaces to include me, to not sort of box me out. I hear struggles with that sometimes, but at the same time they still had natural relationships, natural sort of pipelines for training and mentoring that I didn't necessarily fit in. And then I also am over here, leading teams, a lot of them with men and women, that were answering to me. And I mean, some of it I've really had to kind of figure out myself, or I would have to seek, I would go and seek out someone and say, I need coaching in this area. This is new, for me. Sometimes I went to people outside of the organization or people who knew me well. And so I mentioned in the chapter, Selma Wilson, who was a real trailblazer at Lifeway, the first female vice president there, I believe. She was over B&H Publishing. She had a phrase that she would use that said, own your own development, that don't wait for someone to come along. Don't be sitting there passive, because we can often think, I can't do anything until I get shoulder tapped. And she said, go ahead and find the ways that you can learn, read, seek people out, listen to people you admire, and take everything as an opportunity to grow and develop as a leader. And then I had some great teams who let me, as we would collaborate together, it was a lot of trial and error. What's working, and I was very open-handed, and I was honest with them. This is the first time to ever lead a project like this, or to include them in that journey.
Yeah, Amy, I feel like your experiences and mine have matched in a lot of ways. But one of the things I think has been pivotal in my leadership is to not see the other women around me as competition, but to create an allyship and a relationship, and to really, even if I am the leader, really empower the other women around me to speak into me, to help me. I would learn to listen to their voices and give credibility to mine. And I think as we did that, then as there were more steps to climb up, it was almost as if we were rooting each other on and giving each other what we all needed to move forward. And I think as women, if we could really begin to see our work as given to us by the Lord, then it really doesn't matter if she's called boss and you're called intern. At the end of the day, the Lord is creating this thing that he can use all of us for. And so I think, just being okay with where you are in that work, and then seeing the other women in your space as allies and really working hard to create that, especially that is necessary as Christian women.
Honestly, even just listening to you guys talk, I feel like one of the things while you're talking that I'm thinking is, who are the women that I'm working with, that I can come alongside. I think that part of maybe even, first of all, I love the sentiment of learn, don't make an excuse, do what you need to do to become a better leader, to become better at your skill, to learn figure out what your deficiencies are. But I think that one of the things too is maybe there just needs to be more even intentionality for women that are just seek out a younger woman that is working alongside you and help her along the way. I think that's really, I just think that's really helpful, and I think it's something that we need to hear, whether in the workplace, in the church, whatever it may be. There's so many opportunities where we can really champion one another. But a lot of the times I think our tendency as women, especially in the workplace, because it can be cutthroat, especially if you're in male-dominated spaces, to not help each other out, to kind of see each other as competition instead of as allies in that way. And so I think that even you guys talking, it's like, man, I need to be better at this. I need to be better at championing the women. Go ahead. Yeah, I love that. That's really good. And it is true. So many of the things even that we're talking about, they're just continuing to get better. They really are. They're continuing to get better and better. My experience in the workplace is better than what my mom's experience, et cetera, et cetera. I want to shift over to I want to make sure that I want us to talk through what it looks like to balance all of the many different responsibilities that oftentimes we have as women. Portia, I kind of want to start with you. It's funny because your daughter actually made a cameo appearance on this call, but I do think that there is a reality that, and I'm not saying that men do not experience this. Of course, men are experiencing things, balancing multiple things too. But I want to just speak specifically to the women that have read this book, engaged with us. I just want to talk about being good stewards. How do you steward all of the different responsibilities that you have? And then kind of part two of that question is, when do you know when to draw a boundary? I think we hear a lot of conversations about boundaries, but sometimes I think that we swing too far. I know Jen and I have had this conversation before where it's like, okay, but is a boundary actually just an excuse for XYZ or not wanting to press into a relationship or whatever that may be? So what does it look like to steward the responsibilities we have well, but also be realistic that we are not limitless, that we have limitations? And I would love to hear from several of you just kind of what those boundaries have looked like for you and kind of how you determined when you needed them. But Portia, I would love to start with you.
Yeah. First, I'm going to apologize again because my daughter is not in the room with me now, but she is talking on her iPad with someone and having a great time. So you guys may hear it in the background. But 'tis life. I mean, I say I'm sorry, but I really truly make no apologies for being a mama.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I think the first place that I typically start when we think about what it means to steward our work is understanding that the spaces that we've been called to, the work that we've been given, is God is not oblivious to that. Okay. And I think sometimes we think, well, if it's not exactly what I'm choosing or what is lining up with all the desires of my heart, then is it really work? Absolutely, it is. And it's work that God has given you. And so how do you thrive in that and do that in a way that truly glorifies God? You steward it well. And so I think stewarding our work well, whether it is work in the home, work outside the home, paid work, unpaid work, whatever it is, there's so many different levels, varying levels of work. I think at the center, when we are stewarding well, we first are recognizing, we're humble enough to know that this ain't our show. Y'all probably heard me say this before, but I'm gonna say it again. This is not our show. And so first of all, if we're called to, whatever, mothering, or for me working at Revive Our Hearts or working with She Shall Be Called, the first thing that I know is I am doing this not for my own glory or my own whatever, but I am doing this to the glory of the Lord. And I think that's the first thing that changes the way then how I look at my work, because it's different when we say we're doing something for ourselves, and then when we realize, hold on, I'm actually accountable to somebody, and I'm accountable to God in the ways that I work. And I think our humility would definitely, somebody's totally at my door, so I'm gonna wrap this up. Life. But definitely I think our humility in understanding that our work has been given to us by God is going to then in turn, one second, baby, in turn is going to change our mindset toward how fruitful we are and how faithful we are with our work. When we truly see our work as something that ultimately belongs to God, then we can work in ways where we're thinking about His kingdom first, His priority list first, what it is that He is doing and working, using us, like He's inviting us into His work. And I think that just really changes how we balance things and how we look at the things that we've been given to do.
That's really good, Portia. I love that. I love the faithfulness, fruitfulness part of the conversation. That's really helpful.
And humility, because it starts with humility. If you ain't humble, you can cancel being fruitful or faithful. because I mean I really feel like those two flow out of humility first. There have been times in my life where and I've worked in a variety of capacities. I have been, you know, for now going on 13 years, I've worked in nonprofit organizational management. Now on the ministry side, but I did that on the secular side for so long. And then, like I said, I'm a wife, I'm a mama, I'm working with a ministry. I founded a ministry. I'm writing, I'm doing all these different things, but and I'm doing a lot of things that I love to do now, but it wasn't always that way. And so I would look at my work at one point, like with the side eye, rolling my eyes, like, this ain't what I'm supposed to be doing. And God had to like really show me, no, everything that I call you to in the season that I'm calling you to do it is purposeful. There are things that I didn't like doing 10 years ago that God is using now to further. I mean, he was furthering his kingdom then, but I can see it even more clearly now. And so I just think that that's important. It's important to have that mindset as we work, knowing that he's got the big picture and he's just been gracious enough to call us, to give us an invitation to come and work.
Yeah, that's really good. Elise, or Hannah, what about you? I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of talk about boundaries and kind of springboard off of something Portia was saying about who your work belongs to, who you work for. And I think any Christian woman who has aligned her life in submission and surrender to God is working for God. But in a very practical way, we also have to remember that boundaries allow us to protect the people we are most immediately responsible for. That might be a family or a home. It could be your community, your church. It could be your friends and neighbors that you have developed close relationships with. And so one of the things when we talk about boundaries at work, we're not just talking about preserving our time for ourselves. We're not just talking about preserving our emotional and mental resources so that we can have them. What we're really kind of doing is creating the boundaries with either our jobs or the marketplace or our bosses that's saying, you know what, I've given you the time that you have earned on the basis of the paycheck that you have given me. And this time belongs to my family, my community, my church. And if I give it to you, I'm stealing it from them. And that was a thing that really clicked for me, particularly as I got into writing and speaking and traveling. And because it was ministry at the beginning, I really struggled to have boundaries because I just wanted to do this. And I thought, I'm doing this for God. I'm doing this for the sake of his church. I should be able to just show up. And I had trouble putting a price tag on that. And then I began to realize that my family and my community and my church was releasing me to go serve in these other ways. And I had to have a way to bring back from those other places blessing and goodness to the people that I was primarily responsible to. And so that differentiation of boundaries, not as a form necessarily of just self-protection, although I do think that is a valid use of them, but to say, I am stewarding the time that God has given me. We all have the same amount of time, but I'm also remembering that my responsibilities are not just to my job. They're not just to my boss and my workplace. And I have to find that calculus of making sure I'm not stealing from my family, my community, my church, just because I'm getting pressure from the marketplace.
I also think it's important to remember with boundaries that some of our boundaries are embodied. Like, as you think about embodiment, you think about how there are seasons in which women can have children. We have to sleep, we have to eat, we have to go to like all of these different things that our strength, some people are just naturally not going to be the strongest physically. And so, that there's these boundaries that God has given us to almost force the humility that Portia was talking about. But also if we look at them as good, as God imposed boundaries, then we will enter in our embodied womanhood that says, this season, I can't ... because, and we can list those boundaries and it be okay, because that boundary comes along with our humanity and was placed there for the work that God has created us to do. And I'm the achiever type, so the boundaries annoy me. But then when I step back and think about God's actual plan, I remember, no, God did that for a reason, and that is actually more empowering to live within his boundaries than to fight against them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that I would say, I love that, Missy. And I think one thing that it's important for us to remember is fruitful stewardship looks like stewarding well inside of the parameters that God has given us. And so if we practically think what's one, and somebody just said this in the chat, but what's one parameter that God has given us? We need to rest. So if we are working in ways where we are not resting and we just feel like, oh, I got it, I'm a go-getter, I'm doing this, but we're not resting, then are we really stewarding well the work that God has given us?
That's
no.
Right.
It's not about productivity, so to speak. It is about actually fruitfully and faithfully working to the glory of God in a way that reflects the things, his nature, the things that are important to him. And when we work in ways that are contrary to that, then it doesn't matter how fruitful we're being or how much we think that we're accomplishing. It's pointless. It's pointless. And it's in vain, really. It's in vain.
That's right. Well, and even while you guys are talking, I'm just thinking, for me, the reason a lot of the times Missy said this in the chat, rest, our need for rest reminds us of our weakness. But for me,
and one other thing, and I think this ties into some of what Hannah talked about. Sometimes stewarding well inside of those parameters also means paying attention to some of the things that we, physiologically deal with that others don't. And so that may be, okay, what my work looks like when I'm menstruating may be different than when I'm not. For me, as a person who struggles with chronic illness, and this has been a huge thing that the Lord has just been beating me over the head with, is I often compare what my work looked like pre-Portia dealing with chronic illness to now. And for a while, I had gotten so discouraged and I was like, why am I so lazy? What is going on? I was not like this 7 years ago. And God had to remind me, okay, you're dealing with something in your body that I'm not, I'm not oblivious to that, but that is going to recall you to respond in a different way, to work in a different way. It doesn't mean that you push your work off to the side, but it means that you now work inside of these new parameters that I've given you, and you can still be faithful and fruitful, even if it doesn't match the level of productivity that you had 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no. I was just amening that and saying, yes, that's a good word. Agreed. Okay. One thing that I was thinking, and I don't know if it's hard, this is probably not the number one thing I would say, but something that I keep thinking of that keeps coming back to my mind is something that a mentor said to me very early on in my career. And I thought it was so helpful. And it's something I think back to literally every week. And that is that there really is no such thing as a work-life balance. There's never going to, you're never going to achieve this perfect balance where every week is exactly what you need it to be for work and exactly what you need it to be for outside of work. But what she said is that it's more like the tide, that sometimes it's in and sometimes it's out. And to go with that when there's a work deadline and you've got to be all in on that, walk in freedom and go all in on that. But when that work deadline goes away, then go all in on the tide of family and rest and pursuing other things. And so I think to look for the perfect day or the perfect week or perfect month or perfect year is really futile, but to embrace these natural rhythms and to know that when you're all in over here for a season, then you can be all in over there, next week, next month, next year, and to embrace that freedom and the grace that comes with that.
I sense in so many women I talk to a hunger to have mature women in their lives, dialoguing with them about growing in their careers, call it mentorship. And I just want to encourage women that, if you're able to find a mentor, that's a wonderful thing, but you don't have to wait to have a mentor, an official mentor, to be the kind of person that has intentional, rich friendships with women that are more mature or advanced in their career. And so that would be a challenge that I have for you, is learning to develop a skill of asking for small bits of relational time with women that you admire and respect. Don't come with a full loaded plate of saying, I want you to mentor me, but like, just be open to cultivating relationships. I write about that in my book, Women, Work, and Calling, about what it looks like to respectfully get a little bit of time with that type of woman without putting a huge relational burden that she may not be able to give. And so that would be a challenge I have for you, is just learn to be the kind of woman that cultivates a wide tribe of people who are able to give you input.
Well, I'd take Jen's, I want to build off of what Jen said about the tide coming and going. And I heard it like over the course of a year or a week, but I'd like to kind of shift it and think about your life that way, your career that way. That I know for myself, and I think it's probably true for a lot of women, that our career paths are not straight. They're not straight up a ladder. And the best thing I ever heard described is a portfolio. So you need to think of your work as seasons and experiences and things that you learn here. And that may be the case now, maybe for men as well. But to be willing to let there be a seasonality to your work and not panic because of that, and trust that God has a purpose and plan for your gifts and your work, and that we live very, very long lives. And just to testify to that, I recently went back to grad school at 43. So long lives, lots of opportunities, and just trust the seasonality and the providence of God.
I love that. I love that. Elise, what about you? You're muted right now, so I can't hear you. I'm not sure if she's there or not, so while we're getting that worked out, Amy, you're next on my screen. Yeah, that's really helpful, Amy. That's really helpful, especially since so many of us work remotely. It's important to remember that we do need that personal connection with each other. Portia, I think you're still over there.
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, yep. Okay, it's your turn.
Sure. I would say quality over quantity, depth over breadth. And what I mean by that, if we truly seek to, have our roots just deep down in God, like rooted in Him, then He is ultimately, He's the determiner of, did I make up a word? Maybe I did. He is the one who determines what success looks like in our work, whatever work, whether it's as a mama, as a wife, as whatever. He's the one who determines it. And so my encouragement would be to it matters more how you work, in that you are fruitful and faithful with the things that God has given you. It matters how you work more than how much you're working. So
yeah, that's really good. I honestly need to write that down. Missy, you're next.
Someone said to me about a year ago a quote that has resonated with me, and the quote was, "Better finished than famous." And I think what really is, we live in a society where we want to be seen, and it's natural because we can put all those pictures up and we can curate a life. But these women have all said all of it. God has created our lives in these seasons, and if we really embrace the season we're in and really recognize that the Lord is using it to prepare us for the next one, then the season that we're in may not be our favorite season, but it's a necessary season. And the idea of a portfolio is spectacular because, honestly, the work that I did as a dean of students, I pulled from throwing parties with 5-year-olds, and the work that I've done as an event planner, I pulled from doing ministry at the church with the ladies, free of charge for years and years and years. And so, but when we're really tucking our heads and doing it as unto the Lord, it's really not about being seen. It's about finishing well and leaving a legacy behind us. So I would just say, tuck your heads, do the work that you're in, and remember that at the end, it's not about who knows us. It's about how we stand before the Lord, honoring him. So yeah, better finished than famous.
Oh man, that's so good. Even while you're talking, I'm thinking about so many of the names of women that we see in scripture, and it's like they're just faithful, and here they are, being recognized. They're in the Word of God as just faithful women doing whatever they were doing to serve the church, serve their families, whatever it may be. That's really good. Elise, are you still there? If you're still there, we would love to hear from you on this question too. And if not, I'll throw it to Courtney Moore. I see her recording, but I don't see her face. That's really good. Yeah, I think for me, the thing that even while you guys are talking, I don't really have anything of much more value to add. There's been so much wisdom shared, but I think for me, I would just say that sometimes you're not going to see the fruit of your labor. You may not ever see it, but you certainly you're not always promised to see it right away, but it doesn't mean that you don't continue to labor well. And so I think that, Courtney was just talking about Emmanuel, God with us, but I also think about the God who sees, that even if it feels like nobody sees the work that you're doing, they don't see the effort that you're putting in, they don't see all of these things, that God is the one that sees it, and that he is, that's a way to honor him in working well and just continuing to press in, even when you feel maybe even really alone, or feel in your workplace, you may feel overlooked or undervalued in some ways. Your work still matters. It matters to God, and it matters to his kingdom. So I hate that we're out of time. I feel like we could just chat literally all night. But I just wanted to personally come on and say thank you so much to each of you for contributing to this book, for taking time just to share some of your wisdom and your insight. It has been invaluable, and we've been praying that the Lord will just use this as a resource to help women and to encourage women on their kind of work journey, and just have a bigger view of their work and why it matters to God's kingdom. We have a podcast where we interviewed all of the women that are on this call. We got to talk to each one of them about their chapter specifically. So if you have some more kind of questions about their chapter, if you haven't listened to that, we took a deep dive into each chapter with each of these women. And so be sure to go back and listen to that. And then we have a summer podcast that releases next week, I believe, August the 2nd. And then in the fall, we are going to be launching kind of our regular podcast season. Missy and Courtney Moore do that. And so I'm really excited for that to kind of get back and going. And I think that was all that I had to say. I think Courtney Moore is going to close us out.